Mussolini's foreign policy in the 1920s and 30s has long been the subject of dispute among historians. There are some, particularly the older generation of British historians, and they are characterised by the work of Dennis Mack Smith and Donald Watt, who argue that Mussolini was no more than a blustering and incompetent poseur, that fascist foreign policy in the 1920s and 1930s was, as the Italians put it, a politica del bluff, a bluff policy, and that Mussolini's political career was bereft of any principle other than the wish to acquire and then to maintain his use of power. Indeed, A.J.P. Taylor, who was famous for somewhat misleading bon mots, once remarked, the secret to understanding Mussolini was that he was a journalist. Latterly, and particularly in the 1980s, a revisionist school emerged in Italy, centred around the historian Renzo Di Felice. This school has sought to argue that Mussolini was committed neither to the Democrats nor to the fascist, the Nazis, until a very late stage in his career, that what he sought to do was to balance Italy as long as possible between the rising power of Nazi Germany and Great Britain, who controlled the oceans. So, to this school of thought, the European war that came in September 1939 was both unexpected and unwelcome. After September 1939, for 9 months, Mussolini waited, and then in the summer of 1940, he entered the war on the coattails of Nazi Germany. A third and more recent interpretation of Mussolini's policy suggests that, although he was certainly an unusual politician and not at all cast in the democratic mode, he was not a man without objectives, and he was not a man bereft of policies and indeed, in a certain sense, even perhaps of principles. But particularly that the logic both of his ideology and of his intentions and wishes as far as Italy was concerned meant that sooner or later an alliance with a right-wing, fascist and militarized Germany, which is of course what came along in 1933, was in the inevitable course of history, insofar as anything is inevitable. So, if we then look first broadly at Mussolini's policies, we can see two clear substrata. The first is aggressive nationalism, the idea that the Risorgimento of the mid-19th century was unfinished, and that there was still work to be done. Further, the idea that Italy had not gained from the First World War what she had sought and what she deserved. The legend of the so-called mutilated peace reverberated around Italy and was very much grist to Mussolini's mill. Alongside this, there lay another substratum, and that was the reinvigorated imperialism which would surpass the limited achievements of liberal Italy, the Italy that had forged the Risorgimento and had begun the first steps overseas in the late 19th century. Mussolini clearly believed in this. He remarked early on in his career, imperialism is the eternal and immutable law of life. Well, if these were the substrata, what were the strands that went through Mussolini's policy during the 1920s and 1930s and broadly shaped his attitudes and also, to a very considerable degree, determined what he did or what he sought to do? First, we can say without a doubt that Mussolini nursed specific as well as general objectives. His aim was to expand Italy in the eastern Mediterranean and in the Danubian basin, and ultimately also to extend it along the North African shores. This strand is often depicted as Mussolini's Roman Empire, But I think a better way to think about it is not to envisage one single whole, but to imagine a map of Europe and North Africa on which 3 circles are drawn, each circle overlapping on the Italian peninsula. The first circle contains North and Western Europe. Here, Mussolini had limited ambitions, particularly focused on Austria, at least in the early years, and no immediate objectives, but this was, of course, an area which became of increasing importance in the 1930s. The second of these circles was the circle that encompassed Southeast Europe, including the Balkans, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Turkey. And here, Mussolini had continuing objectives, and as we shall see, he even sought to fulfill them at the very last moment in August 1939, but was not able to do so. And the third circle is the circle that encompassed North Africa, at least down as far as the Sahara, and across to East Africa and the edges of the Indian Ocean. So that over time, Mussolini was seeking to achieve goals in each of these areas. That then is one dimension that we must always bear in mind. A second is that Mussolini nursed profound enmities. He loathed the Slavs, and that meant that over time he was continually concerned to try to conquer Yugoslavia and to dominate it, an objective which only disappeared when it was no longer thought necessary in the middle 1930s. He also profoundly despised and disliked the French. That was partly a result of the legacies of the Risorgimento, where the French had played perhaps too large a part in achieving Italian independence, but also in the 1920s it was an expression of a powerful naval rivalry in the Mediterranean and therefore a latent conflict over the control of space. Mussolini didn't just loathe nations, but he loathed institutions, and particularly the League of Nations, which he regarded as no more than some sort of playground for despised democrats. So that, although particularly in the 1920s and across the divide of the early 1930s, he appeared to be at least a proponent of some of the values of the League of Nations, in reality, as we shall see, he was not. And he was never more pleased than when it disappeared. Finally, it's worth noting that Mussolini had to take account of the flux of international affairs. In November 1922, shortly after he came to power, he read a dispatch from his ambassador in Berlin, Frassati, and underlined one sentence in it. The sentence read, "One makes policy in the circumstances of the present, while taking account of the immediate future." And this very much explains why it was that Mussolini was ready in the 1920s to offer pacts and alliances, but they reflected neither a belief in international balance nor a commitment to negotiation. Perhaps the final point to make is that underlying all of these strands was a readiness, which later became an enthusiasm, to use force. The attempt to seize Corfu in September 1923 is very much and often cited, and it appears to be a lone occasion on which Mussolini revealed his impetuous nature, but was brought to a full stop by the strength of the great powers that resisted this. That is true only up to a point, because it's also true that in February 1923, Mussolini was exploring the possibility of using naval power to support Corsican separatists against France, that in September 1923, he was thinking of a possible war against Yugoslavia, and that in May and June 1924, and again in 1926, there is sufficient evidence to believe that he was thinking of a war against Turkey. So the use of force and violence in support of foreign policy was never far from Mussolini's mind, even though he did not manifest this intention until the 1930s. If we look then at the 1920s, the first goal that Mussolini had was to try to hold France and Germany apart. And the reason that he nurtured that goal was that he feared that otherwise France would pursue her aims, which were to dominate Europe. This policy very soon broke down. In the summer of 1924, Mussolini's domestic situation became extremely delicate as a result of the murder of Giacomo Matteotti. And he was forced to concentrate to a considerable degree, but not entirely, on domestic politics for the next 2 or 3 years. At the same time, in 1924, conflicts began to emerge with France. Conflicts particularly about the rights of Italians who were living in Tunisia, and also about French naval building. The French were about to pass a naval statute which would initiate a minor naval arms race in the Mediterranean. And French naval power in the Mediterranean was something that Mussolini was always unwilling to see and unwilling to accept. What stymied Mussolini from the middle 1920s until 1929 was the shape of international politics, and particularly the appearance on the international scene of Gustav Stresemann. With the demise of the nationalist right in Germany, with the temporary setback of the military, Stresemann represented a democratic force and pursued a policy of alignment with Great Britain and France. That meant that effectively for some 4 or 5 years, it was impossible for Mussolini to do what he always wanted to do, which was to split France from Germany. The turns of international politics simply would not allow of it. Mussolini was, as I've said, preoccupied to some extent with domestic problems. One demonstrable piece of evidence of this is the Lateran Pact with the Roman Catholic Church that was signed in 1929. There were other things too that caused Mussolini to have to concentrate on domestic affairs. The balance of payments began to go seriously awry from 1926. Mussolini then began to pursue a policy of autarky, economic independence, alongside a policy of nationalism. In fact, he had begun to orientate Italy towards economic autarky in 1924, and he had begun to do so with the longer-term view in mind of readying Italy to fight a war or wars. Once again, force was always very well at the forefront of his mind. Even though then it appears that Mussolini was not greatly active in foreign affairs in the latter part of the 1920s. And in fact, Renzo de Felice, who I referred to earlier, argued that effectively there was no active Italian foreign policy during this period of time. Nonetheless, Mussolini was attempting to manipulate the situation to produce circumstances that might favour the pursuit of Italy's broad goals, the expansion of her empire, the penetration of Italy into at least one and maybe 2 of those spheres, the Balkan sphere and perhaps the North African sphere. So, in April 1926, Italy agreed a treaty with Spain. Not at first sight a very important document perhaps, but one that shows us that what Mussolini was trying to do at this juncture was to keep the port of Tangier out of French hands and in Spanish hands. In other words, it was a part of that anti-French policy that always was latent and sometimes very apparent in his conduct.